For 700 years, the only sound on this mountain was the whisper of prayer. The world outside changed, empires rose and fell, but the nuns of St. Catherine believed their stone walls were a fortress of God. They were wrong. In the 15th century, a new shadow crawled across the Mediterranean, one made of gunpowder, steel, and a hunger that didn't care for holy ground. What happens when a place of peace becomes a playground for an army? This isn't just a story of war, it's the story of the day the silence finally broke. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The hills of the Eastern Mediterranean have many secrets, but none were as quiet as the convent of St. Catherine. To the people living in the valleys below, the convent was a ghost in the clouds. It sat high on the jagged rocks, a place where time didn't seem to move. Inside those thick, gray stone walls, life was measured not by hours or minutes, but by the steady rhythm of the heart and the soft flicker of candlelight. The nuns who lived there were women who had turned their backs on the world. They didn't care about the politics of kings or the price of gold in the markets. Their lives were simple. They woke before the sun, they prayed in the chill of the morning air, and they worked the small gardens that clung to the mountainside. The air always smelled of beeswax and dried rosemary. It was a world of absolute, perfect silence. For centuries, this silence was their greatest treasure. It was a holy silence. They believed that as long as they kept their voices low and their hearts pure, the chaos of the outside world could never reach them. The stone floors were worn smooth by the feet of thousands of women who had walked these halls before them, all seeking the same thing, a life hidden away from the greed of men. But in the year 1453, the air began to change. The wind blowing off the sea didn't carry the scent of salt anymore. It carried the smell of smoke. Far to the west, the great city of Constantinople had fallen. The Ottoman Empire was no longer just a distant rumor told by traveling merchants. It was a rising tide, a massive wave of power that was swallowing everything in its path. The Mother Superior of the convent, an elderly woman whose face was a map of wrinkles, watched the horizon every evening. She saw the distant glow of fires on the mainland. She heard the stories of great cathedrals being stripped of their gold and turned into something else. She knew that the sanctity of their mountain was no longer a shield. In the eyes of an empire, a convent wasn't a holy place, it was just land. It was just another stone to be claimed. The younger nuns still prayed, their voices trembling like small birds in a storm, hoping that their devotion would act as a barrier. They didn't realize that empires don't stop for prayers. Empires feed on anything that stands in their way, especially the things people hold most sacred. The peace of St. Catherine was about to be shattered, and for the first time in 700 years, the nuns were afraid of the dark. The transition did not happen with a sudden explosion. It began with a sound that the mountains of the Eastern Mediterranean had never heard before, the heavy, rhythmic thud of thousands of marching boots. It was a low vibration, felt in the soles of the feet long before it was heard by the ears. In the convent of St. Catherine, the nuns paused in the middle of their morning prayers. They looked at one another, eyes wide with a fear they couldn't name. The holy silence, which had protected them for centuries, was being torn apart by the cold reality of metal and wood. The Ottomans did not come as a small raiding party. They came as an unstoppable machine. The 15th century was a time of massive change, and the Ottoman sultans were the masters of this new world. As they moved through the hills, they brought with them the sounds of conquest, the neighing of war horses, the clatter of heavy supply wagons, and the sharp, metallic ring of swords striking against shields. This wasn't just a group of soldiers, it was an empire on the move, and it was headed straight for the gates of the sanctuary. The sisters of the convent climbed to the highest battlements, looking down the winding mountain paths. What they saw took their breath away. A sea of crimson and gold banners unfurled across the valley floor. The sun reflected off the polished steel helmets of the janissaries, the elite soldiers of the Sultan. To the nuns, It looked like a river of fire flowing toward their home. They had spent their lives talking to God in whispers, but the world was now speaking to them in the roar of an army. "Close the heavy gates," the Mother Superior commanded, her voice cracking with age but firm with a desperate hope. "Lock the chapel. We have nothing they want. We have no gold, no weapons. We have only our faith." But the Mother Superior was thinking like a woman of the old world. She did not understand that to an empire, faith is a form of power that must be harvested or broken. The Ottomans didn't just want gold. They wanted the land, the buildings, and the very spirit of the places they conquered. They believed that to truly own a land, you had to replace its old gods with your own strength. As the first scouts reached the base of the convent's cliffs, the nuns retreated into the darkest corners of their stone cells. They huddled together, the smell of incense now masked by the rising dust of the approaching army. They realized then that their stone walls, which had seemed so thick and eternal, were nothing more than a thin shell. The sanctity they had cultivated for 700 years offered no physical shield against a cannon or a blade. The peace of the mountain was gone, replaced by the terrifying realization that they were now part of someone else's history. There is a strange and terrifying hunger that drives an empire. It is not just a hunger for gold or for more land on a map. It is a hunger for the soul of the people it conquers. As the Ottoman forces reached the very gates of St. Catherine, the air inside the convent grew heavy. The nuns could hear the shouting of orders in a language they did not understand. They heard the heavy thud of timber against stone as the soldiers began to set up their camp. The sanctity that had once felt like a warm blanket now felt like a target. It is often said that empires feed on sanctity. This means that when a new power rises, it seeks out the holiest places of the old world to prove its dominance. By taking over a temple, a church, or a convent, the conqueror says to the people, "Your old protections are gone. Your old prayers have no power here. Only the Sultan has power." For the Sisters of St. Catherine, this was a hard and bitter lesson. They had spent their entire lives believing that God lived within these specific walls, and that those walls were invisible to the eyes of greedy men. They were wrong. The gates did not hold for long. They weren't broken down by cannons, but by the sheer weight of inevitability. When the heavy wooden doors finally groaned and swung open, it wasn't a monster that walked in, but a commander of the Ottoman army. He looked around the courtyard with the eyes of a builder, not a worshipper. He didn't see a place of prayer. He saw a strategic high point. He saw a sturdy building that could house his officers. He saw a garden that could feed his horses. The nuns were gathered in the central courtyard, their black robes dusty and their faces pale. They waited for a miracle, but the sky remained clear and blue. The soldiers moved past them like they were part of the furniture. This was perhaps the most painful part of the conquest, the lack of recognition. To the soldiers, these women were not holy servants. They were simply obstacles in a room that needed to be cleared. One by one, the sacred objects were moved. The heavy silver crosses, the ancient icons painted on wood, and the handwritten scrolls were piled into corners. The soldiers didn't destroy them out of hate, they moved them out of utility. They needed space for their maps, their weapons, and their sleeping mats. The sanctity of the convent was being bled out, drop by drop, as the everyday life of a conquering army took over. The sisters realized that the world they knew was truly dying. The faith they had nurtured in silence was now being tested by the loud, clashing reality of a new master. The transition of power within the walls of St. Catherine was not just a physical occupation, it was a transformation of the very air the nuns breathed. For generations, the atmosphere of the convent had been thick with the scent of incense and the low, melodic hum of Greek chants. But as the 15th century marched forward and the Ottoman grip tightened, those familiar comforts began to evaporate. The fading of devout voices mentioned in the ancient records wasn't a sudden silence, but a slow, painful drowning out of one world by another. In the chapel, where the light used to filter through small windows to illuminate icons of saints, a new reality was taking shape. The Ottomans were master administrators of their new territories. They did not always destroy, often they repurposed. The great bells that used to signal the call to prayer were stilled. Their iron tongues were silenced, for the music of the mountain was changing. In many places across the Mediterranean, the high, vaulted ceilings of churches began to echo with a different sound, the rhythmic, powerful call to prayer of the muezzin. For the sisters who remained, watching this shift was like watching a ghost take over their own bodies. They saw the golden crosses being lowered from the rooflines. They saw the walls, once covered in vibrant frescoes of biblical stories, being covered with plain white lime or draped with heavy cloths. This was the shifting of religious and political power in its most visible form. It wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a change in the visual language of the landscape. The horizon of the hills, once marked by the thin silhouette of a cross, was now being reshaped by the rising strength of the crescent. The soldiers moved with an efficiency that was terrifying to the nuns. To the Ottoman warrior, this was the natural order of things. One empire falls, another rises. One faith recedes, another advances. They brought with them their own culture, their own carpets to cover the cold stone floors, and their own sense of destiny. The nuns, once the masters of this mountain sanctuary, found themselves living like shadows in the corners of their own home. They watched as the great hall, where they once broke bread in holy silence, became a place of strategy and laughter. The soldiers sat where the saints once stood. They ate their rations and cleaned their muskets on tables that had held sacred texts for hundreds of years. The political map of the world had been redrawn in ink and blood, and St. Catherine was now a tiny dot in a massive, expanding Ottoman sea. The sanctity of the past was being overwritten by the necessity of the present. The final transformation of St. Catherine was perhaps the most quiet, yet the most permanent. As the 15th century drew to a close, the convent was no longer the place the nuns remembered. The transition from a Christian sanctuary to an Ottoman stronghold was complete. What had once been a vibrant center of prayer and devotion had become a silent witness to a new era. The fading of devout voices was now absolute. The bells remained still, their ropes rotted away by the humid mountain air, and the icons that had watched over centuries of sisters were now hidden behind layers of plaster or moved to dark, forgotten cellars. The nuns who remained were like ghosts in their own home. They moved through the corridors with their heads bowed, not in prayer, but in a survivalist silence. They had seen their world turn upside down. The sanctity they thought was eternal had proved to be as fragile as a bird's egg. The Ottoman soldiers, now well established, didn't even notice the few remaining women. To the empire, the conquest was over. The mountain was secured. The map was colored in the Sultan's ink, and the old stories of St. Catherine were becoming nothing more than whispers in the wind. But something strange happened in that silence. As the years passed, the very stones of the convent seemed to soak up the change. The architecture remained, the high arches, the thick defensive walls, the narrow windows, but the spirit within them had shifted. The churches that had been transformed into mosques now carried the deep, resonant echoes of Islamic prayer. The profound loss of one culture became the profound gain of another. This is the true nature of history. It is not a story of endings, but of transitions. The sanctity didn't disappear. It changed its clothes. It spoke a different language and looked toward a different horizon. Today, if you visit the hills of the Eastern Mediterranean, you can still find the ruins of places like St. Catherine. You can run your hand over the cold, gray stone and feel the history trapped inside. You can almost hear the clash of the 15th century swords against the heavy wooden gates. You can almost smell the mixture of ancient incense and Ottoman wood smoke. The silence that once protected the nuns is still there, but it is a different kind of silence now. It is the silence of a place that has seen the rise and fall of giants. The story of St. Catherine teaches us that nothing is truly permanent. Empires rise on the foundations of the old, feeding on the sanctity of what came before to build something new. The voices of the past may fade, and the names of the sisters may be forgotten, but the mountain remains. The sun still rises over the Mediterranean, casting long shadows across the stone walls that once housed 1,000 prayers and 1,000 soldiers. The cycle of power continues, and the stones simply wait for the next chapter of history to be written upon them. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.